feels like God is far away. Psalm 145 reveals how close He really is to you. There are moments when the soul reaches out in the quiet and feels nothing reaching back. Moments when you whisper a prayer into the darkness and wait for an answer that does not come. Moments when you look for God not in grandeur, but in the ordinary rhythms of your day. And all you sense is an ache that you cannot quite name. In those moments, a quiet fear begins to rise. The fear that perhaps God is not as close as you hoped, that perhaps you are walking this path more alone than you realized. Many people carry this hidden weight. They smile in public, they function, they keep moving. Yet inside there is a slow, persistent question that keeps tugging at the edges of their faith. Why does God feel distant when I need Him the most? Why does prayer seem to fall flat? Why can others speak so easily of divine nearness, while I feel only silence? These questions do not signal a lack of faith. They signal a heart longing for connection. They signal a soul reaching for something real. Right now, you may be standing in that very space. You may be trying to hold yourself together while wondering why heaven feels so quiet. You may be fighting the temptation to assume that distance means abandonment. Yet something in you still hopes there is more to this story. Something in you senses that the silence might not be the end. Psalm 145 holds a truth that has the power to reshape this entire experience, not through argument or pressure, but through a gentle revelation about who God is and how He draws near to those who seek Him. This psalm does not offer quick answers. It offers something deeper. It offers a doorway into understanding the presence of God, not through emotion, but through the unchanging character of the one who sees you fully and meets you faithfully. As we begin this journey together, allow yourself to feel whatever you are feeling. There is no need to hide. No need to pretend you are stronger or more certain than you are. You are entering a space where the weight you carry is acknowledged, where your questions are safe, and where your longing can breathe. In a few moments, we will explore the struggle that makes God feel far away. But before we go there, hold this quiet invitation close. What if the distance you feel is not a sign of God's absence? What if it is the very place where He intends to reveal how near He truly is? There comes a point in every believer's journey when the heart feels suspended between faith and uncertainty. You may know the promises of Scripture. You may remember moments when God felt close. Yet now you stand in a season where your emotions refuse to cooperate. Prayer feels like effort without reward. Worship feels hollow. Your inner strength feels thin, stretched by responsibilities, disappointments, or exhaustion. And beneath it all lies a quiet fear that you rarely speak aloud. What if God has stepped back? What if His newness was something you imagined? What if you were the only one walking through this valley? This struggle takes many shapes. Sometimes it appears in the form of unanswered questions that linger far too long. Sometimes it emerges in grief that remains raw despite your best attempts to move forward. Sometimes it grows in the silence of a tired mind, weighed down by anxiety or the ache of chronic stress. At other times it disguises itself as shame, convincing you that your failures or doubts have made you unworthy of God's attention. In each of these experiences, the distance feels real, tangible, heavy. You are not alone in this. Countless people carry the same quiet burden. They read stories of divine intervention, yet feel no intervention of their own. They hear testimonies of miracles, while wondering why their own prayers seem unanswered. They walk into church, longing to feel that warmth others describe, only to leave with the same emptiness they brought in. These are not signs of spiritual weakness. They are signs of a soul longing for connection. They are the honest cries of a heart that refuses to settle for a distant God. The struggle deepens when you begin to wonder if something is wrong with you. You may question whether your faith is fading, whether you have drifted too far, or whether you are missing some secret that everyone else seems to understand. But the truth is far simpler and far gentler. Moments like these do not reveal a failing faith. They reveal the vulnerability that makes faith real. They reveal your desire for the presence of God to be more than an idea, more than a memory, more than a hope. They reveal your longing for God to be near in a way that steadies your heart and helps you breathe again. As we move forward, we will look at Psalm 145 with fresh eyes, not as a distant ancient text, but as a living witness to a God who meets people right in the heart of this struggle. A God who does not retreat from your weakness, who does not recoil from your questions, and who does not abandon you when you feel lost. Stay with this journey. The distance you feel is not the whole story. There is more waiting to be discovered. Psalm 145 emerges from a heart that has walked through the full landscape of human experience. It is attributed to David near the later years of his life, a season when he had already known triumph and failure, intimacy with God, and moments of bewildering silence. By the time these words were shaped, David was no longer speaking out of youthful confidence. He was speaking out of seasoned trust, a trust formed in valleys as much as on mountaintops. This psalm was not written in a moment of emotional ease. It was written as a declaration grounded in a lifetime of seeing who God continues to be despite fluctuating feelings. Unlike many psalms that rise out of crisis or lament, Psalm 145 is a hymn of steady praise. Yet its praise is not naive. It comes from someone who has cried out for help, waited in uncertainty, wrestled with guilt, and still found that God remained faithful. That honesty gives this psalm its weight. It is not a song inviting you to ignore your struggle. It is a song inviting you to remember that beneath the struggle, there is a God whose character does not shift with your circumstances. In ancient Israel, this psalm held a unique place. It was often prayed not only in moments of celebration, but also in ordinary daily rhythms, as a way of recentering the heart in truth. The people who prayed it were not unfamiliar with fear or disappointment. They recited it because they needed to anchor themselves in something more stable than emotion. They needed to be reminded of a God who remains compassionate, attentive, and near, even when life's noise tries to cloud that reality. Psalm 145 is structured as an acrostic, each verse beginning with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet. This was more than a literary choice. It symbolized completeness, the idea that God's goodness covers the entire alphabet of human experience, from the first word you speak in prayer to the final breath of your longing. It was a way of saying that no part of your story is beyond the reach of God's presence, and no emotion is too complex for Him to meet with tender understanding. When we approach this psalm today, we do so with the same human need that ancient believers carried. We seek grounding, we seek reassurance, we seek a way to reconnect with the truth of God's nearness when our feelings insist otherwise. By understanding the psalm's original purpose, we open ourselves to receive its message, not as distant poetry, but as a living invitation, an invitation to breathe again, an invitation to believe that the God who revealed Himself to David is the same God who is present with you now. As we move to the heart of the psalm, we will discover how its central message speaks directly to the distance you feel. What David declared about God's nature has the power to reshape how you interpret silence, longing, and the ache for connection. Let this context prepare your heart for what comes next. At the heart of Psalm 145 lies a quiet but unshakable truth. God is near to those who call on Him in sincerity. This is not a poetic exaggeration or an idealistic wish. It is a declaration about the nature of God Himself, spoken by someone who had learned through storms and solitude that divine nearness is not dependent on emotion. David names the character of God with tender precision, describing a Lord who is gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, and rich in steadfast love. These are not traits that rise and fall with your spiritual performance. They are constants, woven into the very essence of who God is. One of the psalm's most striking lines affirms that God is near to all who call on Him. It is not a promise for the spiritually strong or the emotionally steady. It is a promise for those who simply turn their hearts toward Him, even when that turning feels fragile or incomplete. The nearness of God is portrayed as something grounded not in your ability to feel Him, but in His desire to be present with you. This means that your longing itself becomes a doorway through which His presence moves. Your whisper becomes a place where His compassion rests. Another profound truth in this psalm is the way it describes God's attentiveness. The Lord is pictured as one who upholds those who are falling and lifts up those who are bowed down. These are not the words of a distant deity. They reveal a God who notices when your strength begins to fade, who sees when your hope thins, and who responds with gentle support rather than judgment. When life bends you low, His hands are already beneath you. When your voice trembles in prayer, He is already listening. Psalm 145 also reveals a God whose faithfulness spans generations. This is more than history. It is a reminder that the same God who met David in caves, fields, and palaces is the God who meets you in your most vulnerable moments. His character has not changed. His compassion has not diminished. His promise of nearness has not expired. If He was close to the broken and weary centuries ago, He is close to the broken and weary now. Your place in this lineage of faith is secure, even when your emotions falter. This psalm does not ask you to ignore your feelings. It invites you to let truth interpret those feelings. It offers a way of seeing God that does not depend on inner certainty, but on the steady witness of Scripture. When David declares God's nearness, he is not making a claim about how he felt in every moment. He is making a claim about what he had come to trust through the long, winding journey of his life. As we move forward, this message becomes more than theological insight. It becomes a lifeline for the moments when your own heart struggles to sense God. In the next chapter, we will explore how these truths can find their way into your daily life, shaping how you pray, how you cope, and how you interpret the silence that once felt overwhelming. The distance you perceive is already beginning to shift. When the heart is weary and God feels distant, the truths of Psalm 145 are meant to become more than comforting ideas. They are meant to be lived. They are meant to breathe through your routines, your thoughts, your struggles, and the quiet corners of your day. The psalm does not call you to force spiritual certainty. It invites you to practice a way of seeing and responding that slowly reawakens your awareness of God's nearness. One of the most powerful ways to apply Psalm 145 is to let its descriptions of God become anchors throughout your day. If God is gracious, then every moment of failure or regret can be met with softness instead of self-condemnation. If God is compassionate, then every surge of anxiety or confusion can become a place where you lean into His kindness instead of retreating into isolation. If God is attentive to those who are bowed down, then the heaviness you carry is not a barrier, but the very place where His support meets you. Another practice is to pause briefly throughout the day and acknowledge the smallest signs of His goodness. Not dramatic miracles, but subtle gifts. A breath of calm in the middle of stress, a moment of clarity when your thoughts were tangled, a kind word from someone you did not expect. These small recognitions do not solve every problem, but they recalibrate your vision. They train your heart to look for traces of God's presence instead of assuming silence is abandonment. You can also begin to shape your prayer life in a way that reflects the Psalm's message. Instead of trying to manufacture feelings of connection, allow your prayers to be honest and simple. Speak plainly. Let your longing be your offering. Even a short prayer whispered in exhaustion becomes meaningful when you trust that God draws near, not because of eloquence, but because of sincerity. Your vulnerability becomes a form of worship. Your truthfulness becomes an opening for divine nearness. It can also be helpful to end your day by naming one moment when you sensed even a small shift toward peace, clarity, or hope. This act does not ignore the real difficulties you face. It simply allows your heart to remember that God's presence often appears in gentle, almost imperceptible ways. Over time, these small recognitions create a cumulative awareness that deepens trust. They remind you that God is not distant, but moving quietly through your life. As you practice these things, something begins to change. The silence that once felt threatening begins to soften. The distance you felt begins to loosen its grip. What once seemed like absence reveals itself as a space where God has been quietly sustaining you, guiding you, and waiting for your heart to rest in Him. In the next chapter, we will reflect on how these practices connect with the way the mind and emotions interpret God's presence, offering a deeper understanding of why this kind of spiritual rhythm can bring real peace. When God feels distant, the mind begins to construct its own stories. These stories often arise not from truth, but from exhaustion, fear, or the lingering shadows of past wounds. The human heart easily confuses emotional silence with divine absence. When you are overwhelmed, your nervous system becomes more sensitive to uncertainty. When you feel lonely, your thoughts naturally drift toward interpretations that deepen that loneliness. None of this means God is far. It means your inner world is reaching for stability. Modern psychology helps us understand why this happens. The mind is shaped by what it repeatedly notices. When pain or stress dominates your attention, your brain becomes attuned to any sign that confirms those feelings. This creates what psychologists call an attentional bias. You see what you fear. You sense what you expect. In seasons of spiritual dryness, this bias convinces you that God must be absent simply because you cannot feel Him. Your emotions become the lens through which you interpret reality, even when the lens is clouded. Psalm 145 gently disrupts that cycle. It invites you to let God's character, rather than your emotional state, become the frame through which you interpret your experience. When you practice noticing small traces of goodness, or whisper simple prayers without demanding instant emotional relief, you begin to shift the focus of your attention. Your mind slowly learns to look for signs of God's nearness. The fog of anxiety loses its power. The inner noise that once drowned out hope begins to quiet. This does not mean your feelings are wrong or insignificant. They are valid signals of what your heart is carrying, but they are not reliable indicators of God's presence. When you understand this, something inside you begins to relax. You stop assuming that emotional emptiness means spiritual abandonment. You stop interpreting stress as a divine withdrawal. You begin to see that God's presence has been threading through your days in ways your tired mind could not recognize. As your attention shifts, your heart opens. As your fears soften, your faith breathes again. The distance you felt starts to look less like a wall and more like a veil. And with time, that veil becomes thinner, allowing glimpses of a God who has never stepped away. In the next chapter, we will look at how embracing this truth can lead to deep transformation, renewing not only your faith, but the way you move through each day. When the truths of Psalm 145 begin to settle into your life, transformation does not arrive as a sudden burst of certainty. It unfolds gently. The way morning light slowly enters a darkened room, you begin to notice a quiet shift inside you. The questions are still present, but they no longer hold the same weight. The ache is still there at times, yet it no longer defines your relationship with God. Something in your heart begins to steady, not because every prayer is answered immediately, but because you are learning to trust the one who listens, even when the answer is still unseen. This transformation begins when you allow yourself to be honest with God without believing that honesty creates distance. You start to pray not to prove your faith, but to express your need. You begin to notice the subtle ways God sustains you throughout the day. A moment of clarity in confusion, a breath of calm when anxiety rises, a conversation that lifts your spirit without warning. Slowly, these quiet mercies form a mosaic of divine presence. You realize you are not walking alone. As you deepen this awareness, your inner posture changes. Instead of straining to feel God, you begin to rest in the truth of His nearness. Instead of interpreting silence as abandonment, you see it as a space where God invites you to trust more deeply. Instead of being overwhelmed by uncertainty, you find yourself anchored by the constancy of His character. This anchoring does not silence every storm, but it gives you a center that storms cannot touch. Over time, this trust transforms how you move through your days. Your prayers become conversations rather than demands for reassurance. Your hope becomes more resilient because it is no longer tied to fleeting emotions. Your sense of identity shifts from what you feel in a moment to who God has declared Himself to be. You begin to live with a calm rootedness, a quiet confidence that God is weaving grace into every corner of your life. Imagine waking up tomorrow with this sense of steady companionship. Imagine facing uncertainty with a grounded trust that does not collapse under pressure. Imagine walking through your routines aware that every breath, every thought, every moment is held by a God who is near. This is the transformation Psalm 145 invites you into. A transformation that does not erase your humanity but restores your hope. As we come to the closing chapter, we will gather everything we have explored into a moment of prayer, allowing the truth of God's nearness to move from understanding into lived experience. Holy God, in this moment of quiet, we open our hearts before you. You see the places where we feel stretched thin, the thoughts that unsettle us, and the longing we carry for a sense of your nearness. We bring every ache, every doubt, every silent question into your presence. We ask that you breathe peace into the places where fear has taken hold, and remind us that your compassion is not distant, but close enough to steady our trembling spirit. Lord, draw near to the one who is listening now. Let them sense the gentle strength of your faithfulness. Teach them to recognize the subtle ways you move through their day, lifting them when they feel bowed down and sustaining them when the weight is too much to carry alone. Help them trust that you are present even when their emotions grow quiet. Let your nearness become their anchor, their comfort, and their guiding light. May their heart find rest in the truth of who you are. May their days be touched by moments of unexpected grace. May their prayers, even the simplest ones, be met with the warmth of your listening love. And may the message of Psalm 145 continue to echo within them, reminding them that they are never forgotten and never alone. If this reflection spoke to you, share your experience in the comments so others can find strength through your story. If you would like to continue walking this journey of faith and restoration, consider subscribing. And if this message brought you peace, return to it whenever your heart needs to remember that God is near.